I am Nadia Reyes, and I need you to understand something before this story begins. I am not angry. I was never the kind of person who got loud about things that mattered. I was the kind of person who got quiet and then got to work. On the evening of March 14th, I sat at a round table in a restaurant called Aurelian's in Austin, Texas. White tablecloths, crystal stemware. 17 members of my family arranged a half moon of practiced smiles and good perfume. My sister Camille was at the center of the table in a blush pink dress, her fiance's hand covering hers like a paperweight. My father stood up. He tapped his champagne glass with the dessert fork, 3 clean strikes, and the table went quiet. What he said next lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I know because I timed it. Not in the moment. Later, when I replayed it from memory, the way I replay code, looking for the logic error, the place where the system broke, he said many things in those 4 minutes and 22 seconds. He praised Camille's law degree. He praised her taste in men. He praised her future. He used the word brilliant 4 times. He used the word focus 3 times. Then he looked at me, and he smiled the way people smile when they're about to say something they've rehearsed enough to believe is kind. He said, "And then there's Nadia, who we love very much, still out there in her garage, figuring things out." The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My mother touched her collarbone and looked at the centerpiece. Camille looked at her fiancé. I looked at my phone, which was face down beside my bread plate. At 4:47 p.m. that afternoon, 2 hours and 11 minutes before my father stood up to speak, I had signed the final documents on a $47 million acquisition agreement with Veridian Systems, a San Francisco-based technology firm. I had signed them in the parking lot of Aurelian's restaurant, sitting in my car, in my dress shoes, with a pen I'd borrowed from my own attorney. The wire had already cleared. My father was still laughing, picked up my water glass and took a sip. I did not say a word. Not yet. Welcome to Revenge Pulse, where every story is calm, documented, and completely true to the people who lived it. If you are new here, this channel is for anyone who was ever told they weren't enough by someone who hadn't built half of what they dismissed. Before we go further, if you have ever sat at a table and smiled while someone underestimated you, drop a "I stayed quiet" in the comments right now. Let's get into it. I am the second daughter of Roland and Patricia Reyes. Roland is a retired civil engineer. Patricia taught high school English for 26 years before her niece made standing for 8 hours a day impractical. They are not cruel people in the way that cruelty is usually described. They never raised their voices. They never withheld food or shelter or the tuition payments they made on time for both of their daughters' undergraduate education. What they withheld was simpler and harder to prove. They withheld the assumption of competence. Camille got it automatically. I had to apply for it every time, and I was denied every time. And after a while, I stopped applying and started building something else entirely. Camille is 4 years older than me. She is 34. She graduated from the University of Texas School of Law in the top 12% of her class. She passed the bar on the first attempt. I ran 2 extension cords from the house. I bought a space heater for $47 from a hardware store that smelled like sawdust and motor oil. I put a folding table against the east wall, 3 monitors on the table, and I started building a data routing infrastructure tool that I believed could cut enterprise cloud redundancy costs by 34%. When I told my father what I was working on, he nodded the way people nod when they're waiting for you to finish. When I told my mother, she said, "That sounds complicated, sweetheart. Are you eating enough?" When I told Camille, she said, "What's the exit strategy?" And then, before I could answer, her phone rang and she walked away to take the call. I had been building for 7 years by the night of that dinner. In those 7 years, my father attended 4 of Camille's professional milestone events, a bar passage celebration, a firm partnership announcement dinner, a speaking panel at a legal conference in Houston, and a birthday party where her colleagues were also invited. He flew to Dallas for 3 of them. In those same 7 years, my father visited my workspace once. He stayed for 22 minutes. He asked where the bathroom was. He said the space heater looked like a fire hazard. He was not wrong about the space heater, but he was wrong about everything else. My company was called Latticework Systems. By the time of Camille's engagement dinner, it had 11 full-time employees, a client list of 23 mid-size enterprises, annual recurring revenue of $4.2 million, and a signed acquisition term sheet with a San Francisco firm that valued it at $47 million. My father did not know any of those numbers. He had never asked. I want to tell you about a pen. Not a special pen. Not a heirloom. A matte black Pilot G2 retractable ballpoint, the kind that comes in a 12-pack from any office supply store for $9.99. My grandfather, my mother's father, Emilio Castillo, gave it to me when I was 19 years old and home for Thanksgiving during my sophomore year of college. He pressed it into my hand at the kitchen table after dinner, while everyone else had moved to the living room. He smelled of coffee and the wool sweater he wore every November without exception. The pen was warm from his shirt pocket. He held my hand around it for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and he said, "Whenever you sign something that matters, use a pen you remember." That was all. He didn't explain further. Emilio Castillo was not a man who explained further. He had immigrated from Guadalajara at age 23 with $180 in his pocket and built a small but profitable tile manufacturing business in San Antonio that he ran for 41 years before handing it to his son-in-law, my uncle, at retirement. He understood what it meant to build something from a room that wasn't designed for what you were doing inside it. He died 4 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in October, at the age of 79. I was at a client meeting in Houston when my mother called. I excused myself, walked to the parking garage, sat in my car, and held the phone for 6 minutes before I could drive. I had carried that Pilot G2 in my laptop bag for 8 years by the time of Camille's engagement dinner. The pen I used to sign the $47 million acquisition documents in the parking lot of Aurelian's restaurant at 4:47 p.m. on March 14th was that pen. It ran out of ink on the third signature page. My attorney, Marcus Webb, who had driven from his office 6.2 miles away specifically to witness the signing, handed me a replacement pen from his own briefcase. I finished the signing with his pen, but I started it with Emilio's. I put the Pilot G2 in my clutch purse when I was done. I walked into the restaurant in my dress shoes. I found my seat at the table. I placed the clutch beside my bread plate. The pen was inside it the entire time my father was speaking. Emilio Castillo saw what my parents did not see. He saw it early. He saw it clearly. And this is the part that I did not know until 14 months after his death. He did something about it. Let me tell you what he saw first. When I was 11 years old, I disassembled a broken clock radio from the garage and rebuilt it using parts from 2 other broken appliances. It worked. Not perfectly. It gained 4 minutes every 12 hours, but it worked. My mother's reaction was to ask whether I'd wash my hands before dinner. My grandfather's reaction was to sit down on the garage floor next to me and ask me to explain every step. I talked for 40 minutes. He listened for all 40. When Camille won a mock trial competition at her law school, my father had it framed, the certificate, 11 by 14 inches, in a dark walnut frame, and hung it in the hallway of their house in Cedar Park, Texas. It is still there. When I closed my first enterprise contract, Linfield Group, $214,000 annual contract, 18 months into building Latticework, I told my grandfather. He asked me to send him a copy of the signed agreement, not because he understood the technology, because he understood what a signed agreement meant. He had it laminated. He kept it in his desk drawer. I found it there when we were cleaning out his home office after his death. It was inside a manila folder labeled, in his handwriting, Nadia, the real work. But the laminated contract was not the most important thing in that folder. The most important thing was a letter. It was typed, single-spaced, 2 pages, dated 16 months before he died, addressed to a man named Dr. Franklin Osei, the founder and then chairman of Viridian Systems. Emilio had met Dr. Osei at a small business innovation summit in San Antonio 3 years before his death. They had spoken for 27 minutes at a breakfast table. Emilio had told him about his granddaughter. He had described Latticeworks systems in enough detail, the infrastructure, the client model, the scalability, that Dr. Osei had later told me he'd gone home that evening and looked up the company. The letter in the folder was a formal letter of introduction. In it, Emilio described my work with the precision of someone who had listened carefully for years. He wrote, "She does not ask for rooms to be made easier. She builds what the room requires, and then she builds the next room." At the bottom of the letter, below his signature, was a handwritten postscript, "She'll be fine." She was always going to be fine. The letter had been sent. Dr. Osei confirmed it when we first spoke on a video call two months ago. He said, "Your grandfather reached out to me first. I want you to know that. What you built earned this, but he's the reason I was looking." Emilio Castillo filed his documents before he died. He left the folder where he knew I would find it. He did not tell me ahead of time because he did not want me to build for him. He wanted me to build for the thing itself. Now I need to show you the two timelines, because this is not just a story about one dinner. It is a story about 7 years of parallel tracks, what my father was saying and what I was doing, running side by side, never intersecting, until March 14th, year 1. What my father said. At Christmas, when I described the garage workspace, he turned to my uncle and said, "She's always been the creative one. Not really a business head, but creative." What I did, filed the LLC for Latticeworks Systems on January 9th, wrote the first 4,200 lines of the core routing algorithm alone, in the garage, between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., on nights when the space heater made the air smell like warm metal. Year 2. What my father said. When I told him I was taking a $40,000 small business loan to hire my first employee, a systems architect named Priya Menon, who had turned down a job at a larger firm to join me, he said, "Nadia, I just want you to be realistic. Not everyone is meant to run a company." What I did, hired Priya, closed our first 2 paying clients within 90 days, repaid $18,000 of the loan ahead of schedule. Year 3. What my father said. At Camille's firm partnership announcement dinner, which he attended, flying to Dallas and back in one day, he gave a toast. He said Camille had always known what she wanted and gone after it with everything she. He had not called me in 47 days. What I did, signed the Linfield Group contract, $214,000 annual recurring revenue, moved Latticework out of the garage and into a 1,800 square foot commercial space in East Austin, hired 3 more people. Year 4. What my father said. My mother called to tell me that Camille had been featured in a Texas lawyer magazine profile. My mother read me 2 paragraphs from it over the phone. At the end she said, "I keep hoping you'll find something more, I don't know, stable." What I did, raised a $2.1 million seed round from a venture firm in Austin, had a meeting in San Francisco, started talking to larger clients, flew economy both ways, and did not expense the flights because I was watching the burn rate. Year 5. What my father said. Thanksgiving. The table. My uncle asked what was new with the company. Before I could answer, my father said, "She's still working on it. You know Nadia, she's always got a project going." A project. What I did. $2.8 million in annual recurring revenue. 8 full-time employees. First inbound acquisition inquiry from a firm in Chicago, which I declined because the terms weren't right and I knew the product wasn't ready. Year 6. What my father said. He called me in February to ask if I could contribute $3,000 to a surprise 35th anniversary trip for him and my mother to Portugal. I said yes without hesitation and sent the wire that afternoon. He said thank you. He did not ask how the company was doing. He did not ask. What I did. Expanded to 11 employees, signed 7 new enterprise clients, started formal acquisition talks with Viridian Systems, hired Marcus Webb as my attorney, began 9 months of due diligence, document preparation, valuation modeling, and negotiation. Year 7. March 14. What my father said. And then there's Nadia, who we love very much, still out there in her garage, figuring things out. The table laughed. What I had done. 2 hours and 11 minutes before he said it, signed the final acquisition documents for $47 million in the parking lot, in my dress shoes, with Emilio's pen. My father stood at the head of that table, and he described the version of me he had decided on 7 years ago and never updated. He wasn't lying. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. He genuinely believed what he was saying. He had looked at my life through a window he stopped cleaning a long time ago, and he described the smear on the glass as if it were the view. I sat with my hands in my lap. I breathed through my nose. The restaurant smelled of warm bread and something herbed, thyme, maybe rosemary. My water glass was cold and wet at the base. I pressed 2 fingers against it and held them there. Camille met my eyes once across the table. She looked away first. Her fiancé, a man named Derek, a financial analyst with a firm handshake and a Rolex he'd mentioned twice already, raised his glass and said, "To the whole family." I raised my glass. I drank. I set it back down. I waited. 7 years. 7 years of being described as the project, the face, the one who's still figuring it out, while the work was happening, documented, and real. If you have ever been talked about in a room you were sitting in, type, I was right there in the comments. We're just getting to the part where the 2 timelines collide. I want to be precise about something. I am a software engineer by training. I think in systems. I think in inputs and outputs, in conditional logic, in what happens when variables change. I do not make emotional decisions without first understanding the architecture of the situation. So let me tell you what I had documented before March 14th. Not because I planned what happened at that dinner. I didn't. I had not told a single family member about the acquisition. Not because I was building toward a reveal. Because I had learned, over 7 years, that telling my family about milestones before they were complete created a specific kind of damage. The kind where the achievement gets downgraded in real time by the people who should be celebrating it. I had told my grandfather. I had told Marcus. I had told Priya. That was enough. What I had documented, formally and legally, in the 9 months leading up to the signing, a full valuation report from an independent financial advisory firm, Garrison & Lowe, based in Austin, placing Latticeworks' enterprise value at $44.6 million before negotiation. The final acquisition price of $47 million reflected a premium Veridian's board approved after their technical due diligence team spent 6 weeks inside our codebase and came out, in the words of their lead engineer, genuinely impressed. A complete IP portfolio, 3 registered patents, 2 pending, all filed in my name and transferred to the company entity at formation. No outside claims, no co-founder disputes, clean. A client contract file, 23 active enterprise agreements, all current, no material breaches. Average contract length 2.1 years. Average annual value $182,600. Marcus had organized these into a single binder, 2.3 inches thick, tabbed and indexed, that sat on my office desk for 4 months before the deal closed. A cap table showing 100% founder ownership. No dilution beyond the seed round investors, who held a combined 18% stake and had already agreed to the acquisition terms in writing. And one more document, an email, printed, dated 8 months before the dinner, sent from my father's personal email address to a man named Gerald Pratt, a retired investor who had briefly considered putting money into Latticework during the seed round before declining. The email read, in part, "Between us, Gerald, I wouldn't put money there. Nadia's smart enough, but she's never had the focus to finish things. It's a personality issue. Always has been." Gerald Pratt had forwarded that email to Priya, who was a mutual contact of his. Priya had forwarded it to me with a single line. "You should have this." I read it once. I saved it to a folder labeled reference. I did not respond to it. I did not confront my father about it. I did not tell my mother. I filed it, and I kept building, because here is what I understood. In systems terms, the email was an input that changed nothing about the output. The product was the product. The clients were the clients. The code did what the code did regardless of what my father wrote to Gerald Pratt on a Tuesday evening. The only thing the email changed was my certainty about one thing. When the moment came, I would not need to explain myself. The numbers would do it. Numbers are not emotional. Numbers do not argue. Numbers do not require anyone's validation to be true. $47 million is $47 million whether my father believes it or not. On March 15th, the morning after the dinner, I made 3 financial decisions. The first was straightforward. I transferred $1,200,000 into a donor-advised fund I had established 14 months earlier at the Austin Community Foundation. The fund was designated for STEM education grants for first-generation college students in Travis County. I had been contributing to it in smaller amounts for 2 years. This was the first major contribution. The second was personal. I wired $85,000 to a trust account I had created for my grandfather's surviving sister, my great-aunt Rosario, 81 years old, living in San Antonio on a fixed income of $1,340 per month. Emilio had worried about her in the last years of his life. I had been helping with her expenses in smaller amounts since his death. The $85,000 was to be managed by a trust officer and distributed in monthly increments to cover her housing, medical, and living costs for the next 6 years. The third was the one that mattered most to the story. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, cheerful and unhurried, still on the warmth of the previous night's dinner. I said, "Dad, I wanted to let you know about something before you read about it elsewhere. Latticework Systems was acquired yesterday by Veridian Systems for $47 million. The transaction is complete. I wanted you to hear it from me." There was a silence. 4 seconds. Then he said, "I'm sorry. How much?" I said, $47 million. The press release goes out on Monday. Another silence. Then, "Nadia, I had no idea." I said, "I know." That was all I said. I said goodbye. I told him to enjoy the rest of his weekend. I ended the call. I did not explain. I did not summarize 7 years. I did not reference the toast. I had not called to make a point. I had called because he was my father and he deserved to hear it first. The point had already been made. It was made at 4:47 p.m. the previous afternoon, in a parking lot, with a pen that smelled like its own ink and a set of papers my attorney would courier to San Francisco by end of business. I drove to my office on March 15th at 7:14 a.m. The building was empty. It was a Sunday. The East Austin commercial space, 3,400 square feet by then, not the original 1,800, had the particular silence of a place that is normally loud. The air smelled like cooling electronics and the dry erase markers Priya used on the whiteboard she refused to let anyone else touch. I sat at my desk. I opened the manila folder I had brought from home. I took out the laminated contract, the Linfield Group agreement Emilio had kept in his drawer, and I set it on the desk. I took out his letter, the one addressed to Dr. Franklin Osei. I read it again. The whole thing. Both pages, single-spaced. I got to the postscript. She'll be fine. She was always going to be fine. I sat there for a while. I want to be honest. It was not a triumphant feeling. Not yet. The triumph came later, and it was quieter than I expected. What I felt that morning, alone in my office with the letter on the desk, was something more like grief wearing the clothes of gratitude. I had spent 7 years building something real, and the person I most wanted to call when it was done was the person who had been gone for 4 years. I would have given back a significant portion of $47 million for 22 more minutes with Emilio Costello in that kitchen, at that table, with the smell of coffee and his wool sweater and his 2-second grip on my hand around a Pilot G2 pen. I did not cry in the office. I did not cry on the drive home. I cried at home, in my kitchen, for approximately 8 minutes before I put the kettle on and made tea and opened my laptop and began answering the 34 congratulatory emails that had arrived since Marcus sent the announcement to our internal distribution list. Then I closed the grief. Not permanently. Grief doesn't close permanently, but I had work to do, and Emilio would have been the first person to say so. My father made 3 moves after the phone call. I had expected this. Escalation is a predictable system response when a person's internal model of reality is contradicted by external data. He had a model of me. The data no longer fit. He needed to resolve that, and people like my father resolve it by explaining it away, then minimizing it, then attempting to claim proximity to it. Move 1. The explanation. On Sunday evening, March 15th, my mother called. She said, and I could hear him in the background, the faint sound of his chair on the kitchen floor. Nadia, your father wants me to tell you that he always believed in you. He just didn't realize how far along you were. He said the dinner comment was just a joke. You know how he is at these things. A joke. I told my mother I understood. I said I would talk to her soon. I ended the call. He had not spoken those words himself. He had sent it to my mother. He was not ready yet. Move 2. The minimization. On Thursday, March 19th, he called directly. The Viridian press release had gone out Monday morning. 3 business publications had picked it up. A technology newsletter I had not heard of ran a brief profile that included my name, my age, and the acquisition price. The article described Latticework as a quietly remarkable infrastructure play built over 7 years by a founder who reportedly declined multiple acquisition offers before accepting Viridian's terms. My father's call lasted 9 minutes. He said he was proud. He said he had always known I was working hard. He said 47 million is a lot of money, in a tone that suggested he was still calibrating the number against something he couldn't quite name. Then he said, of course, a lot of this is timing. Tech valuations right now, they're inflated across the board. The market's doing the heavy lifting for everyone. I let him say it. Then I said, the independent valuation was done 14 months ago and came in at $44.6 million. The market premium was $2.4 million. The core valuation held. He said, right, sure, of course. I asked how he was feeling. He said fine. We talked about the weather in Cedar Park. I said goodbye. Move 3. The claim. This one I had not fully anticipated, though I should have. On March 26th, he sent an email to Derek, Camille's fiancé, the financial analyst, suggesting that, given the family connection to the acquisition, Derek's firm might want to discuss wealth management options for the family's new position. He had used the phrase, the family's new position, as if the $47 million were a family asset, as if proximity to it were the same as participation in it. Derek, to his credit, forwarded the email to Camille. Camille forwarded it to me. She said nothing else, just the forwarded email. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Marcus with a single note for the file. It became the second document in the reference folder. The third escalation was also the one that revealed, briefly, something human in my father. On April 3rd, he called again. This time there was no positioning, no explanation, no market commentary. He said, I didn't know, Nadia. Just that. I didn't know. I believed him. That is the complexity I will give him. I believe he genuinely did not know. Not because the information wasn't available. I had told him, in broad terms, what I was building, every year, for 7 years. But because he had made a decision early about what I was, and he had maintained that decision the way people maintain a belief, by not looking too hard at the evidence that contradicts it. He didn't know because he hadn't wanted to know. And on April 3rd, on the phone, for the first time, he seemed to understand the difference. I said, I know you didn't, Dad. He said, I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry. Please. He said it exactly once. I said, I hear you. I did not say more. I did not say it was fine, because it was not entirely fine. I did not say it didn't matter, because it did matter. It had mattered for 7 years. But I also did not say it was unfixable. I left room. That was enough for that day. He said please exactly once. After 7 years, after 1 toast, after 3 escalations, once. If you think the dinner is where this ends, you're wrong. There is still 1 scene left, and it happens in public. Comment, I'm still watching, and let's get to the part that changes everything. I want to tell you about the Austin Technology Leadership Summit. It is an annual event held at the Long Center for the Performing Arts in Austin, Texas. It draws approximately 800 attendees, founders, investors, civic leaders, university faculty. It has a main stage, 3 breakout tracks, and a networking reception that runs from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. I had been invited to speak at it 3 years in a row and had declined each time because I did not believe in speaking about work that wasn't finished. In April, 6 weeks after the acquisition closed, the organizers called again. This time they weren't asking me to speak about lattice work. They were asking me to deliver the keynote. The theme of the summit was built, not borrowed. They wanted to tell the story of founders who had built from scratch, without institutional support, without family wealth, without a pre-existing network, and arrived somewhere real. My keynote slot was 18 minutes. I accepted. I wrote the speech in 4 sessions over 3 weeks. I do not write the way some people write, in bursts. I write the way I code, in iterations. Draft, test, revise. Draft, test, revise. I sent the final version to Priya, who read it and said, "It's good. Don't change anything." Priya does not hand out compliments as a social courtesy. I trusted her. I did not tell my family about the keynote. I did not invite them. What happened next was not something I arranged. My father, who had joined the Austin Regional Business Council 2 years earlier as part of a volunteer advisory board role for retired engineers, received his regular council newsletter in April. The newsletter listed the keynote speakers for the upcoming summit. My name was on the list. He called and asked if he and my mother could attend. I said yes. The long center on the night of the summit was the particular kind of beautiful that Austin does in April. Warm air. The city lights across Lady Bird Lake. The smell of cedar and cut grass coming through the open terrace doors before the program began. I arrived at 5:15 p.m. for the speaker check and sound test. I wore a charcoal blazer, a white shirt, dark trousers, and my black dress shoes, the same ones. I had cleaned and conditioned the leather twice since March 14th. Emilio's pen was in my blazer pocket. I did not plan to use it that evening. I just wanted it there. My parents arrived at 6:47 p.m. during the networking reception. I saw them across the room. My father in a blazer I recognized from 4 years ago. My mother in a blue dress she had worn to Camille's bar passage celebration. They were with 2 other couples from the business council. My father saw me. He raised his hand in a small wave. I nodded. He looked, not pale, white, like the moment when a system encounters a value it wasn't designed to process, and it simply holds, suspended, for one cycle. I went backstage at 7:30 p.m. At 7:52 p.m., I walked onto the stage of the long center to 800 people. The applause was polite at the start, the kind reserved for names people recognize, but don't yet feel personally connected to. I stood at the podium. I looked at the room. I found my parents in the 4th row. My father was sitting straight. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. I began. I did not open with the acquisition. I opened with the garage. I said, 7 years ago, I ran 2 extension cords from a rented house in South Austin into a 400 square foot detached garage. I bought a space heater for $47. I put 3 monitors on a folding table, and I started building something I didn't have a name for yet. I paused. I named it latticework. A lattice is a structure made of cross strips, individually. Each strip is just a strip, but the crossing points are where the structure gets its strength. I named it that because I understood, from the beginning, that what I was building was not going to be strong because of any single element. It was going to be strong because of how everything connected. The room was quiet, the right kind of quiet. I moved through the speech methodically. I talked about the first 4,200 lines of code. I talked about Priya. I talked about the Linfield Group contract. I talked about the 7 years of iteration, client rejection, product rebuilding, and financial constraint. I did not mention my family, not directly, but I said this. There is a specific kind of noise that follows founders who don't look like the expected shape of a founder. I don't mean external market noise. I mean the noise that comes from the people closest to you, who love you, genuinely, but who have decided what you are before you've decided what you're going to become. That noise is not malicious. It is just inaccurate. And one of the most important technical skills I developed over 7 years was learning to isolate that noise from the signal. I let that breathe. The signal was the work, always work. I looked at the fourth row for 1 second. Only one. My father was looking at his hands. I continued. I talked about Dr. Osei, about the due diligence process, about the 9 months of documentation, negotiation, and revision that preceded the signing. I described the moment in the parking lot. I said exactly that, a parking lot, where I sat in my car in my dress shoes and signed the final pages of a $47 million acquisition agreement. The room shifted. The applause that had been polite became something else, warmer, more personal. Several people were leaning forward. I said, I had a pen with me that my grandfather gave me when I was 19 years old. He told me, whenever you sign something that matters, use a pen you remember. I used that pen to start the signing. It ran out of ink on the third page. A small laugh from the room, warm. I finished with a borrowed pen, and I thought about that afterward. The way so many things start with what someone who loved you pressed into your hand, and get finished with tools you find along the way. Both matter. The borrowed pen is not a lesser pen. I paused. My grandfather was a tile manufacturer from San Antonio who built something from a room that wasn't designed for what he was doing in it. He saw that in me before I fully saw it in myself. He is not here tonight, but he is, in some very specific way, the reason this acquisition exists, because he wrote a letter. Before he died, he wrote a letter to the man who would become my acquirer, and he described my company with more accuracy than any pitch deck I ever prepared. I took one breath. He wrote, she does not ask for rooms to be made easier. She builds what the room requires, and then she builds the next room. I did not know about that letter until 14 months after he was gone. When I found it, I understood something I had been circling for years. The work is never only yours. It belongs to everyone who saw it clearly and chose to say so. The room was completely still. I looked up. I said, I am Nadia Reyes. I am 31 years old. I built a company in a garage in South Austin with a $40,000 loan and a space heater that was, in fact, a fire hazard. And I want every person in this room who is sitting in a room that wasn't designed for what they're doing to stay in the room. Build what it requires, then build the next one. I stepped back from the podium. The applause that followed was not polite. It was 800 people deciding simultaneously that they meant it. I did not look at the fourth row again. I did not need to. After the keynote, there was the reception. I stood near the terrace doors for 41 minutes and spoke with founders, investors, a dean from UT Austin's engineering school, and a 23-year-old woman in a blazer that was slightly too large for her who told me she was building a hardware startup in her apartment and asked if she could email me. I said yes. I gave her my card. I told her the blazer was fine. My parents found me at minute 38. My father put out his hand. I shook it. My mother hugged me, brief, tight, the smell of her familiar perfume, something floral she had worn my entire life. My father said, that was, Nadia, I didn't, that was remarkable. I said, thank you. He said, the things you said, about the noise, I know some of that was. I said, Dad, it's okay. He looked at me. He was 63 years old, and in that moment he looked like a man who had just sat through a precise and complete accounting of something he had done slowly and without noticing, and was now being asked to hold the total. I did not show him the email to Gerald Pratt. I did not mention the toast by name. I did not enumerate the 7 years of phone calls not made and visits not taken. I did not need to. He had heard the keynote. He was an engineer. He understood the math. My mother asked when I was moving to San Francisco. I said June. Priya was staying in Austin to manage the integration team. I was leading the new product division at Veridian's headquarters. My mother said, will you be happy there? It was, genuinely, the right question. I said, I think so. Yes, she nodded. She touched my arm once. My father had nothing else to say that evening. That was consequence enough. Not his collapse, not his apology in a public room. Just silence, where there used to be commentary. Silence, where there used to be still figuring things out. The account was settled, not with drama, with arithmetic. 3 weeks before I left for San Francisco, I received an email. It was from the 23-year-old woman in the too large blazer. Her name was Simona Chaby. Her hardware startup, a low-cost environmental sensor device designed for agricultural use in regions with limited infrastructure access, had been rejected by 7 accelerator programs in 8 months. She said she was considering stopping. She said, "I keep being told the market's not there, but I've done the research. I think the market is there, and the people evaluating it just can't see it yet." I don't know if that's confidence or delusion. I read the email twice. I wrote back. I said, "The fact that you can distinguish between those two things is itself a signal." Delusional people don't ask the question. Test the assumption with the smallest possible experiment, not to prove the investors wrong. To know, yourself, whether the signal is real. Document everything. The documentation is not bureaucracy. It is how you tell the noise from the work. I also connected her to a program officer at the Austin Community Foundation's STEM grant fund, the one I had contributed $1,200,000 to on March 15. I do not know what will happen with Simone's company, but I know she will not stop because of the noise. I made sure of that. I thought about Emilio pressing a pen into my hand at a kitchen table and saying, "Whenever you sign something that matters, use a pen you remember, without explanation, without a business plan, without a guarantee. Just, here is a tool. Here is the belief that you will need it." I gave Simone the smallest version of what he gave me. The work carries forward. That is the only legacy that actually compounds. I moved to San Francisco on June 11th. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a building in the Mission District, 847 square feet. The windows face east. In the mornings, when the marine layer hasn't come in yet, the light is the specific kind of clear that makes everything look slightly more decided than it did the night before. I have a home office. It is not a garage. It has a door that closes properly and a desk that does not fold. On the desk, in a small black frame, is Emilio's letter. Both pages, behind glass. The postscript visible at the bottom right corner. "She'll be fine. She was always going to be fine." Beside the frame is the laminated Linfield Group contract. The first one, $214,000. His handwriting on the folder tab. "Nadia, the real work." The Pilot G2 pen, the one that ran out of ink on the third signature page of a $47 million acquisition agreement, on the afternoon of March 14th, in a parking lot in Austin, Texas, sits in a small ceramic dish to the left of the frame. Empty. Done. Exactly as it should be. I bought new pens when I arrived in San Francisco. A 12-pack of Pilot G2s from an office supply store near my building. $9.99. I keep them in the desk drawer. When I sign something that matters, I use one of them, and I think of him, and I begin. The door to my office closes with a soft, clean click. Every morning, I close it. That click is the sound of the room being exactly what it should be. My father called me a project. He meant it as a gentle diminishment, the kind that doesn't feel like cruelty because it comes from someone who genuinely does not understand what they're looking at. But a project is not an insult to someone who builds things. A project is a system with inputs, logic, and an output. The input was a folding table, a space heater, and 4,200 lines of code written after midnight. The logic was 7 years of iteration, documentation, and refusing to update my identity based on someone else's inaccurate data. The output was $47 million, a keynote, a grant fund, a letter in a frame, and a 23-year-old woman in a too large blazer who is still building. He called me while still figuring things out. He was right about the figuring out. That part never stops. The figuring out is the job. He was wrong about the still. As if time spent building is time wasted. As if the only work that counts is the work that announces itself loudly before it's finished. I built it quietly. I documented everything. I signed what I needed to sign. And I walked into the dinner in my dress shoes. The rest was arithmetic. If this story stays with you, do 3 things right now. Subscribe to Revenge Pulse. This is what we do here. Every time. Drop a comment. Tell me the one sentence someone said about you that you're in the process of making incorrect, and share this with one person who is sitting in a room that wasn't designed for what they're doing. Tell them to stay in the room. The work knows what it is. Nadia Reyes, founder, builder, very serious.